Hello, and welcome to the first part of our presentation on tinnitus. I'm Helen Pick, and I'm going to be talking about the sort of technical side of tinnitus and where we think it's produced. And my colleague Susan Broughton will be presenting the second part, and that's on management of tinnitus. Now, as I'm sure you've been told, there is no cure for tinnitus, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done. And this is what we're going to be looking at today. So the aims of the session today, we're going to have a look at the basic anatomy of the ear and try and give you an idea of the mechanisms of tinnitus. So we give you information on hearing and tinnitus perception. And then Susan will be looking at examples of management strategies and how you can implement them. And we'll give you an idea of decisions on further management where you can take things forward to better deal with your tinnitus. And every person who experiences tinnitus is an individual. So tinnitus presents itself in myriad different forms. The most common one that we describe is whistling or ringing, but it can actually be any sound that you can perceive. There are certain factors, though, that are common to every case, and those are the generic factors that we'll be dealing with today. Unfortunately, we're not going to propose a cure for tinnitus in this session, but do please keep watching. So, what is tinnitus? Essentially, it's any sound that you can hear that does not have an external source. It's not a phantom perception of sound. It's not imaginary, but a real sound as far as we can define it. So it's not like getting a tune stuck in your head. So how do we define it? Well, clearly it has to be audible to the person experiencing it. It's involuntary. The person is not making it come and go. They're not producing it at will. It originates in the head, so the sound comes from somewhere in your head. It's not a tummy rumbling. We can further define it or break it down into 4 different types. We talk about subjective, which is self-reported, so you can hear it, nobody else can, which is obviously the most common. There are reactive tinnitus, so that will change with an outside stimulus. Some people will find if they pull a face or touch their face, the tinnitus can change. It might be certain sounds will set it off, worsen it, or indeed help to quieten it. We have somatic sounds, so the body's making sounds. You might find you have a clicky jaw. More often than not, we can experience movement in the muscles in the middle ear, which we call a myoclonus, and that can produce different sounds like drumming, tapping sounds. In very rare cases, we have objective tinnitus, and that's a sound that actually can be heard by other people. We talk about the sound being produced centrally. So although it might seem to have its origin in the ear, if it's produced centrally, it means it's actually being perceived in the brain. And we'll come back to this a little bit later on. But the evidence that we can give for that is in the past, surgery has been done to sever the acoustic nerve. So there's no connection between the ear and the brain, but in only 1/3 of those cases did the people get rid of their tinnitus. So we talk about the incidence of tinnitus, and essentially what we mean by that is how common is it? You may have heard about this experiment. Back in 1953, 80 people who didn't have any kind of tinnitus, or they didn't perceive any kind of tinnitus, were put into a soundproof room and asked to listen very carefully. 93% of those people then came and said they had heard some kind of a sound. So the conclusion was that some kind of background noise is normal. Now, in the general population, 10 to 15% will be aware that they have some kind of tinnitus, and that will rise in the over 55s. 1% of people report a severe tinnitus that affects their daily lives. 80 to 85% of people with tinnitus have some form of hearing loss. And as hearing loss increases, the tinnitus tends to become more noticeable. But it is possible to have tinnitus without any kind of measurable hearing loss. A lot of people will say they don't notice their tinnitus for hours at a time while they're doing something interesting. But then they might sit and think, oh, I haven't heard my tinnitus today. And then there it is. And the one thing guaranteed to make your tinnitus seem louder is listening for it and waiting for it to stop. The good news is, for most people, tinnitus improves over time. So I said we'd mention the basic anatomy of the ear, so we know where we're looking at when we talk about generation of tinnitus. So the outer part here is the pinna, that's the ear on the outside, ear canal there. There at the bottom is your eardrum. 4 is the ossicles, the tiny little bones in your middle ear that helps transmit sound. Eustachian tube down here, and that can sometimes be responsible for some of these somatic sounds we talked about. Up at the top there, number 6, the labyrinth. That's the part of the inner ear that deals with our balance, keeps us orientated in space. And there, number 7, named for a snail shell, looks like a snail shell, that's the cochlear. So that's the organ of hearing, if you like. That's kind of where we're talking about with most tinnitus. So how does all this come together to make us hear a sound? Well, sound is a travelling wave that's moving through the air. When one of these travelling waves enters the ear canal, it vibrates the eardrum. Those little bones, the ossicles, act as an amplifier and pass that vibration through and on into the fluid in the cochlea. And those vibrations are then turned into an electrical signal, which travels along the auditory or the acoustic nerve up to the brain to be processed. So all hearing is actually taking place in the brain. So we have a change from mechanical movement to an electrical signal, which is what the brain interprets as a sound. So when we talk about baseline cochlear activity, what do we mean by this? Well, as with any process in our bodies, the ear doesn't switch off. It's sitting there saying, here I am, I'm ready to hear. Generally speaking, the brain will filter out stimuli that don't change. So although there is a constant signal going on, the brain should filter that out in exactly the same way as you are sitting on your chair, or you're not aware of the chair, you're not aware of your clothes unless you start to think about it, because we can't cope with all of the myriad information that's coming at us all the time. So our brain has had to learn to filter out some of that stimuli. That process is called habituation. So a good example of that is when you pop your glasses on top of your head and then you can't find them, you've forgotten they're there because your brain is not feeling them. It's got used to that sensation. So we think there are some things going on with tinnitus perception. We don't fully understand this process as yet. So we could roughly define these as biological factors and psychological factors. So if we can agree there's some degree of perceived noise in the hearing system all of the time, and that's normal. Now the brain accepts this and uses it as a monitoring system to check that all is well. And we can call that positive feedback. It could be that damage to the cochlea or the nerve causes some kind of disruption to that positive feedback signal. And that registers in the brain as a malfunction. And so the brain alerts to activity in that system, a little bit like the onboard computer in your car setting off an alert that something's gone wrong. Now, it may be a hearing loss that we can measure, or it may be that our tests are not sensitive enough to pick up that early damage. Many people will have experienced this if they've been in a very noisy pub or club where there's a lot of sound. When you come out of that situation, you feel as though your hearing has gone muffled. You might notice a noise at that time. Very often, overnight, that will clear. But if we keep putting ourselves in that situation, eventually we might end up with a more permanent tinnitus. So once the brain has measured that fault or registered that problem, it could lead to an increase in what we would call internal gain. So the background electrical activity is somehow turned up, or the brain becomes more aware of it. And we can see that in the way that caffeine affects us. It effectively turns up our perceptions. And the same thing happens when we have other anxieties. All of our senses go on alert. Some drugs do affect tinnitus, like aspirin, for example. But as with all of these effects, it's very important that you do not stop taking any medication that you've been prescribed without discussing it with your doctor. So now we've seen how it's possible for tinnitus to emerge. But what else is happening here? And we can talk about then awareness of tinnitus. So why do some people hear it, some don't? Some people hear it but just ignore it. But why does it bother me so much? So sound and survival, we're constantly monitoring our surroundings without thinking about it. And hearing is particularly important to this process. And it's allowed us to evolve as hunter-gatherers, listening for the rustle in the grass that might mean there's a predator creeping upon us. Now, our instincts haven't moved on too far from that early human. How many times have your kids made you jump by creeping up and shouting boo? Young babies will startle at any sound. But by the time they're toddlers, they've learned to respond to some sounds and ignore others. And we all do this. So, for example, if we're sitting in the garden, there are familiar sounds going on around us. There might be lawn mowers, a little bit of traffic in the background. And we're reading a book and we can focus completely on our book and ignore these other sounds. But if something different happens, a dog barks or somebody shouts or there's a siren, instantly you're alert. You come out of your book, you look around and you decide whether you need to act. And we respond to many sounds without thinking about it. We like to make life easy for ourselves, and we often learn by repetition. So this is a shortcut, essentially, in our brains. But these instant responses can change subtly. So think about that phone ringing. If it rings at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you'll have a different response to how you might feel if it were ringing at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so heightened anxiety and stress will increase our responses or change our responses to sounds. I'll put this slide in just to show we all react differently to sounds. We're all individuals, as I've said. And this just shows that we don't even have to hear the sound. We just have to have an idea of it in order to provoke a reaction. So there's something else going on there, and that other something could be an emotional response. So not only do we have safe sounds and warning sounds, but we also have sounds that evoke different and powerful emotions. It could be fear or anger or sadness. And it could be that you have a reaction to a piece of music, for example. And that reaction might be associated with that very early on. It might be repeated each time you hear that piece of music. But that response can change, as we've seen with other sounds. So would you still love that same piece of music so much if you listen to it constantly for a month? Or if you associate that piece of music with a night out or with a particular person, if you were to fall out with that person, your response, your emotional response to that piece of music might change. So our emotional response to tinnitus might initially be very much like this poor lady here. And we tend to ask ourselves questions. And it might be, what is it? Why me? If you're 1% of the population who's severely troubled by tinnitus, you might talk to people around you and they'll just shrug and wonder what you're talking about. So it can make you feel quite alone when you have tinnitus. What's wrong with me? We all monitor our bodies, and if something changes, then we tend to think that something has gone wrong. And sometimes we'll go for that worst case scenario, something very bad is happening. Am I going mad? After all, they say, don't they, if you hear sounds that nobody else can hear, it's obviously a sign of madness. And fear of the future. Will this noise get louder? Will I be able to cope with it? Where is it going to end? All of these questions can lead to a negative response and therefore anxiety and therefore maintenance of the tinnitus. And it's important, therefore, that you see your GP or you'll see one of our specialists for tests and to get reliable information about tinnitus. So, where does tinnitus come from? Why do some people notice it more? Why can we live our lives and not notice this background sound, and then suddenly something changes and we do? So something happens. It can be some kind of trauma. It could be a noisy nightclub or an ear infection, or it could be something completely unrelated to hearing, such as a period of great stress or anxiety or a bereavement. Once we've spotted that tinnitus, then we begin to check on it. So just like a crack in the ceiling, once we've seen it, we check on it, we monitor it. And without even being aware, we can pick our sound out of the background noise. And then we can end up with this troublesome tinnitus. So remember how we saw that our brains are alert for anything new. So tinnitus often presents following some kind of trauma. And it, as I say, it could be ear-related or it may be completely unrelated. Once we become aware of that noise, even if the initial cause resolves, we can still be left with the tinnitus. Our brains create this shortcut to allow us to constantly monitor and thereby maintain the tinnitus, and often our negative feelings towards it remain, unless we consciously work to change that negative response. So if we accept that tinnitus is a normal, natural sound of the body, and we can't switch it off, but remember, tinnitus alone can't harm us. It's not a disease or an illness. It is just a sound, just like the wind in the trees or the dog barking. What causes the distress is the way that we react to it, our emotional response, our anxieties. So to deal with the tinnitus, we must change the way that we react, the way we feel about it. And that's where we do have power. So as we've seen, the emotional responses to sounds that we can change and can be changed with awareness, with training and time. It's possible for anybody to change the way they think about something and so change the way that they react to it. We can change that shortcut in our brain to take us a different way. And we can end up as individuals, perhaps not quite making friends with our tinnitus, but at least beginning to accept it. And I remember speaking to someone as part of a routine examination. I'll ask people if they hear a sound in their ears. And this person said, yeah, I hear a noise all the time. Sounds a bit soppy. I suppose it's the music of the soul. Thank you for listening.